Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And in general, I try to be hopeful for the future of that world. But if I'm being honest, the extent of that hope really fluctuates over time. And as I've gotten older, my faith in humanity has taken more than a few hits. That's not to say I've completely lost faith in people or the future of the human race, but compared to how I felt 10 years ago, I'm not nearly as hopeful as I once was. Now, that may just be a byproduct of me getting older, because for many people, getting older is often associated with becoming more jaded. And depending on your circumstances and experiences, your perspective will change as you deal with the world around you and the people within it. You don't always get a choice in what or who you encounter. You also don't always get a choice in how it'll make you feel. But in terms of how you make sense of it all, that's where things can get tricky. Because we are all subject to so many influences over the course of our lives, and they're bound to shape us in ways that we do not expect. And this brings me to why I am making this video. Because I'm now at a point in my life where my perspectives have been shaped, reshaped, broken down, and rebuilt in numerous ways. And without getting too personal or specific, I'll just say that my ideologies, my politics, and my entire conception of the world has changed a great deal since I was a teenager. And I don't doubt it'll continue to change as the years go by. But more recently, especially in the years since the rise of social media, I've noticed something striking about my fellow human beings and how they interact. It has informed everything from how we discuss politics to how we argue over personal tastes to what we think of other people who aren't like us. In the past, I might have been more inclined to downplay the severity of these observations, choosing instead to maintain a more hopeful outlook overall. But over time, I have found these sentiments harder and harder to overlook. And after one too many discussions about politics as well as one too many deep dives into the comment sections, I have come to an important realization that I would like to share. And it goes like this. Hatred and bigotry always wins out in people, but only to a point. I know, that's not a very uplifting sentiment. If it were the theme of a movie, a TV show, or a book, it would be pretty awful, regardless of the story. But rest assured, I didn't come to this conclusion after having one too many bad days. This is just something I've come to observe over the years. But let me be clear. When I say hate and bigotry, I don't necessarily mean that in a political context. I'm referring to the more generic sense of the term that most of us feel to some extent in our day-to-day lives. Because we all have days in which we just hate everyone and everything around us. We all have topics, ideas, and even individuals that we hate with a passion, often to an irrational extent. I also think most people understand on some levels that this kind of hatred is rarely healthy or rational. Because it's one thing to hate someone who is directly threatening you and your loved ones. It's quite another to hate some random stranger or celebrity you've never met or some trend you find infuriating. That kind of hatred requires a certain level of bigotry, and no matter how level-headed or rational you might be, it's impossible to avoid all the time. We are, after all, only human, and as such, we're subject to human limitations when it comes to emotions, feelings, and thoughts. Now, that's still not an excuse. It doesn't make irrational hatred any less ugly or damaging. But when you get to a certain point in your life, you start to notice recurring patterns and cycles with respect to hatred, both within yourself and within others. Now, when I was a teenager, it was not uncommon to hate people for any number of petty reasons. From whether or not they liked Pokemon, to how fat or ugly they were, to their favorite episodes of The Simpsons. Hell, I once knew a kid who hated me just because of my name, mostly because he fought with someone else who happened to have the same name. But as teenagers, we get a pass to some extent. We're still ignorant, inexperienced balls of hormones who haven't learned enough about the world around us yet. But even as an adult, you come to see similar cycles of hatred and bigotry with people who can't rely on youth as an excuse. Throughout my early life, I've seen that hatred manifest towards people like Monica Lewinsky, or people who were part of the LGBTQ+ community, or celebrities like Paris Hilton and the Kardashians. But regardless of how understandable or misguided that hatred might have been, it was still prevalent, and social media and the internet definitely made us more aware of these sentiments. And as a result, the more we're aware of it, the more prevalent it seems. That perception may or may not reflect how people really feel in their day-to-day lives, but there's no reason to believe that such hatred is a total facade. It's still tempting to assume that all this hatred and bigotry is entirely irrational, seeing it as some reflex or flaw in how people interact with one another. A few will even claim that things like the internet, movies, TVs, books, video games, or some other moral panic is behind such flawed mentalities. But having experienced multiple moral panics play out over the course of my life, I've come to realize that these tendencies towards hatred and bigotry, it's a feature and not a bug. People don't irrationally hate or judge others because they're inherently flawed or evil. Sure, there are some truly malicious individuals with a limited capacity for empathy and understanding. But they're often in the extreme minority. For the vast majority of people, regardless of their circumstances, these feelings of hatred and bigotry just tend to be the path of least resistance. That's often what it boils down to. At the end of the day, hatred and bigotry is just an easier recourse, a less arduous and taxing alternative to actual introspection or, God forbid, a painful realization that you might be wrong. To fully understand, just think about the last political debate you had. Just think about the last argument you had with someone from a different religion, or no religion at all. Or just think about a discussion you had with someone on your favorite movie or TV show in which you disagreed. Our natural inclination is not to just take in all the information, process it logically and thoughtfully, and come to a reasonable conclusion with a reasonable range of emotions. Our inclination is to cling to whatever we already feel and believe. And it just tends to be much easier and much less distressing to hate anything or anyone that differs from those sentiments. That certainly doesn't make it right. That doesn't necessarily make it wrong either. But again, this is a feature, not a bug. Human beings are wired to be tribal. Forming tight-knit, cohesive groups is part of our evolution as a species. We can't override that any more than we can override the fact that we're primates. To be logical and thoughtful about our sentiments might make more sense. It might even lead to better, less destructive outcomes for the most part. But that just isn't how most people are wired. That's not to say that people are incapable of changing. They're just always going to be more inclined to resist that change. And in most cases, just clinging to whatever feelings and opinions we've always had is just a lot easier by default. To actually change, grow, and adapt our perspectives on the world, that's always going to be harder. It's certainly worth doing in some cases, and a lot of people do make that effort, but not everyone chooses to on a regular or consistent basis. Some people are always going to cling to their ideas, opinions, and sentiments with infuriating stubbornness, sometimes to their own detriment. Others will be more reasonable, choosing to listen, understand, empathize, and adapt. And at times, it feels unavoidable in an ever-changing, often chaotic world. For me personally, I try to maintain a sense of balance. I try not to be too stubborn, and I also try not to abandon certain perspectives too readily, if only to avoid the pitfalls of groupthink. It is a never-ending struggle, and I'm certainly as inclined as anyone to simply taking the path of least resistance for myself as well as for others. But therein lies the limits of hatred, bigotry, and everything in between. We can only ever follow these sentiments to a point. That's why when I say hatred and bigotry always win out, I need to make clear that there is a larger context. Because embracing hatred and bigotry isn't just inherently irrational, it's also very short-sighted. It always lacks depth and nuance. And it can only ever give people a narrow, simplistic view of the world or of people. And that kind of approach will only ever take us so far, both in terms of navigating this world and in terms of dealing with said people. These feelings might be our first inclination, but they're always going to be incomplete and reactive. And it only ever makes sense in the grand scheme of things if we don't think about it. And while some people will go to great lengths to avoid that kind of scrutiny, the human brain can only do so much to mute its own thoughts. Eventually, shallow feelings like hatred and bigotry are going to conflict with more complicated emotions. Because just as we're inclined to be tribal and reactionary, we're also inclined to avoid hurting ourselves and others. Our capacity to feel guilt for our actions and empathy for others' suffering, those are also feelings we cannot avoid. Yes, they can be easily circumvented in some situations, like sitting behind a computer screen rather than dealing with someone face to face. What we do in the heat of a moment before we have a chance to think it through, it's always going to feel different down the line with the benefit of hindsight. But there really is no perfect way to navigate this sort of thing. Hatred and bigotry are very much an inescapable part of our collective mentality. But still, it's an overly simple approach to a complicated world filled with complicated people. It's neither stable nor sustainable in terms of surviving and thriving. We can't avoid it completely, but we can try to manage it as best we can. That's why I chose to make this video. That's why I'm choosing to share these insights. It'll always be easier to hate, judge, ignore, and denigrate. And it's always going to be harder to listen, understand, empathize, and scrutinize. We cannot choose to turn off these feelings that are so inherent to the human experience. But we can choose to make an effort to be better. And if enough people make that effort, then who knows? Maybe there's still hope for the human race and whatever future we forge together. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.